last two speakers, I've also organized my thoughts in terms of the three questions we were given. First, how does this interdisciplinary perspective shift our conceptualization of international development? The devil's advocate in me contemplated a vigorous defense of disciplinary perspectives, but I won't do that. But I do think it's worth mentioning that part of the reason disciplines are useful is that they're about a collective and sustained conversation over time. So people are communicating with one another and sharing ideas in a way that might not be as kind of intense or have as much depth in an interdisciplinary view. So I'm more or less kind of in the interdisciplinary camp. As a geographer, I think geographers do certain things well. We're one of the few disciplines that bridges the natural and the social sciences in terms of kind of resource management questions, so I think that's a strength that we have. We have this tradition of field work. We're very attuned to processes operating at different scales, so studying how local resource management issues may be connected to processes operating at national or international scales. And of course, we have our kind of mapping tradition, looking at spatial patterns, trying to understand why we see so much difference in development indicators across space and how those processes are connected to one another. But I also realize that geographers don't address well a lot of questions within development. We're not very good at coming up with kind of elegant normative solutions like the economists are. We're not particularly good at kind of sustained ethnographic study in one particular place like the anthropologists are. So, I inherently believe that all disciplines have something to offer. Development is this multifaceted process, so it makes sense to approach it from a variety of disciplinary angles. Well, I think what's interesting to me is that despite the kind of seemingly obvious advantage of an interdisciplinary approach, in practice, many development institutions are dominated by a particular discipline. So historically, the World Bank has been dominated by economists. We have lots of dam building agencies that have been dominated by engineers. Many agricultural development agencies are dominated by agronomists. So the results are somewhat predictable, a very kind of narrow view of the world that solves a very narrow problem, but then misses all these other kind of complicating factors, so-called externalities. Why is this? Okay, as the first speaker suggested, this may be a question of power. Okay, disciplines have power and they enforce their kind of view on the world and take over certain agencies, if you will. But I would assert that it is also a kind of failure of interdisciplinary development studies training in the United States, that we see this problem occurring over and over again. And it's not to suggest that we would kind of solve the world's development problems if the kind of expertise of formerly trained people was more interdisciplinary, but perhaps the way we're trained makes us kind of less open to being humble, as the second speaker suggested. So the second question was about the trends and issues affecting current approaches to international development. I have two thoughts to share here, and these both come from a recent trip to Mali in West Africa. I was there for most of the month of July this past summer. And first thought has to do with a trend which started during the Bush administration and has continued over into the Obama administration, and this is the increasing blending of development work and anti-terrorism work. And I think this is linked to the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, this notion that we have to win the hearts and minds of local people so that the military, U.S. military, has increasingly become involved in development work. And then, quite problematically, that approach seems to be moving out of war zones into areas of the world very minimal conflict type situations. So in Mali, there are Al-Qaeda cells. They exist in the northern desert of the country, particularly along the Algerian border. So these were groups that oftentimes are not composed of Malians. They were Algerians that have been kicked out of the country. They're affiliated with Al-Qaeda. But it's really a minimal kind of security threat within the country of Mali. Yet the U.S. government, in terms of its foreign assistance, has increasingly, in large parts of the country, been using soldiers, U.S. military, who have no development training at all. They don't have the kind of soft skills of language or kind of many of the issues we've been talking about today. So they're doing things like, building schools, building roads, and this changes the local population's whole perception of what development is. And, they very much see this as part of a kind of military effort rather than kind of humanitarian assistance. So I find this a very kind of problematic trend, which is moving out of war zones. Second trend, which was brought home to me when I was in Mali this summer, is what I guess I would term as a resurgence of a very kind of technical or technocentric approach to development. So many of you in this room are probably aware that Rajiv Shah is the new head of USAID. He comes out of the Gates Foundation, where he led their agricultural development effort. And the Gates Foundation, along with, ironically, probably the most famous alum of my college, Kofi Annan, have been huge supporters of what is called the New Green Revolution for Africa. So we're going to, the idea is that the first green revolution bypassed Africa, and through improved seed packages, we're going to solve the development crisis in Africa. So this is very much become kind of front and center within our bilateral foreign assistance arm. I think it's hugely problematic because it is, first of all, it is blind to history, okay? Despite the assertion that the first green revolution bypassed most of Africa, there were significant green revolution efforts in the post-independence era in many parts of the continent. So in the 60s and 70s, there was a kind of a food self-sufficiency focus within agriculture. But then, after kind of 20 years of neoliberalism, starting in the 80s, with structural adjustment, many of the state agricultural agencies were dismantled. Okay? Tariff barriers were removed, which allowed cheap grains to come in from the outside. So now in West Africa, 40% of rice comes in largely through places, Vietnam, Thailand, a bit from the United States as well. So that worked as long as international food prices were low, but the shit really hit the fan in 07, 08 when global prices went up. So in come the Gates Foundation and now USAID. We're going to solve this problem with improved seed varieties. The big one they're pushing is Eureka rice, which is new rice for Africa. It's a blend of Asian and African varieties. And crazy things are happening on the ground. In southern Mali, rice is traditionally a women's crop. They're pushing this new improved rice with men. They're growing it in dryland areas where they used to grow it with cotton, which local people can't quite get their head around, nor can I. Right? And there are no credit systems to kind of buy the inputs to support this type of rice production. So this kind of technological fix that is very ignorant of kind of gender issues and the infrastructure and the history that you need to take account of when you do kind of lasting development is kind of missing. So last question has to do with kind of the future of the interdisciplinary field of development studies. And I would assert that development studies has always been weak in the United States. I think this probably has something to do with, we don't have a formal history as a colonial power in many parts of the world like the Europeans do. So development studies has tended to be stronger in places like Europe than the United States. But I think it has become actually quite a bit weaker in the last 10 to 20 years. And I think part of this has to do with the government's interest in development studies. There are very weak links between our academic institutions and the major bilateral assistance arm, USAID, in the United States. That some of this happens. We have CRISPs, which are the Collaborative Research Support Programs in agriculture, which exist. But there's not a lot of government funding for development work, which leads to decreasing collaboration between academics and development practitioners. Now, it's not to suggest that this is a one-way problem. I think many academics are quite suspicious of collaborating with government. But the government, particularly since the Bush years, has been quite reluctant to connect with academia, and rather has increasingly relied on the so-called Beltway bandits. And I guess I would contrast this with the UK, which has much tighter links between its academic community and DFID, the Department for International Development. So there was government assistance which set up kind of major development think tanks at big universities in the UK, Manchester, Sussex, East Anglia, and there's an expectation that academics affiliated with development studies at those institutions will spend part of their time consulting on development work. And DFID's Sustainable Livelihoods approach has clear links to academic work in the UK. And I don't know as much about the Norwegian system, but my impression is that there and other Scandinavian countries, there's tighter links between academia and kind of the world of practice and development as it's supported by government. So what I'm going to argue, and this perhaps will stir up some questions and be controversial, is that we need more of this. I'm going to argue that it's a win-win situation because it opens up development practice to kind of the critical eye of academia. But I think it also forces academics who can be very, very critical of development work without actually ever having done it themselves, which I find problematic. So that I think there are advantages to more tightly linking these two communities. And I think they have a lot to benefit from one another. So I'll just end with a point that has also been previously been made. And this too has to do with kind of the future of development studies. That, Macalester it's a very internationally oriented college. We have lots of students who come in who are interested in international studies and development studies. They come, they take critical development courses, and I see this progression over the years, so that by the time they're seniors, oftentimes, they're very disenchanted with the whole development process. And in fact, they don't want to deal with it all. They just as soon go home and kind of contemplate their navels and till their garden, rather than engaging with the rest of the world. So I feel like, this is it's a failure of higher education. I would assert that part of that failure may have to do with this divide between scholarship and practice, and that if we could bridge that divide better, that would go a long ways towards solving this problem. And what I tell my students is, yes, development is a hugely problematic process. I want you to be intensely critical. But that doesn't mean that we should kind of give up on the entire process. Deprivation exists, poverty exists, and whether we like it or not, these places in the world are, as another speaker said, in a continual process of underdevelopment. So we need to rethink this relationship and figure out how to do it.